Thanks so much to Zach and Emma for letting me do this. For those of you who were here yesterday, and folks who kind of have been in on this conversation, you know, this has been something that we've been developing a long time. This was originally supposed to be a set of AEG sessions, but I think is developed in really great ways. Emma and Zach have put forth a tremendous amount of effort in order to make this possible. I've just been staggered by how thoughtful they've been in terms of how to organize something that I think is really novel for a lot of us in kind of odd times, but I think really taking advantage of some of the opportunities that we have to do things in a different way, and something I think a lot of us who worked on climate change for a long time have really welcomed. I think it's already been, you know, a really productive set of conversations, lots more papers in the workshop part of this later, which I'm sure will be producing lots of great stuff for everyone to engage with in due course. So without further ado, I wanted to kind of do a brief introduction of this paper. What I'm doing kind of a hybrid thing here. I have recently published this paper as part of the relaunch of City in 2020, which I would urge everybody to please go check out. Kind of ongoing thanks to Andrea Gibbons and editors of City for really putting together something I think pretty extraordinary in terms of, again, the level of effort they've put forward, but just the collection of kind of short interventions in this special issue is really amazing, and I've been getting a lot out of it. So I have this paper that's kind of extant within that. I didn't want to just kind of read the paper since it's kind of already out in the world. And I wanted to take the opportunity to have some kind of forward-looking conversations for both kind of where I was trying to make arguments in this shorter intervention, but also some places where I think it could go productively, trying to do some more kind of programmatic work in thinking about the kind of broader theoretical needs of our kind of shared field. And so hopefully this will be useful and interesting, and you'll have lots of things to push back on me on, hopefully, because I think there's a lot of conversations that we all need to have in a kind of fast growing area of research. So let me just make sure I can, here we go. So what I wanted to talk about, the kind of starting point for this work was something I've been thinking about for a long time in a lot of different kinds of areas of my work. And that's this question of the lifetime of cities, the obduracy, the ephemerality of built environments, both in general and the kind of ways that built environments change over time. Besides political economy, I've engaged for a long time with some of these cultural geographic traditions like cultural landscapes in geography, you know, that have been looking at these questions for a long time. And I think we have a real resource to exploit further in thinking about how climate change will affect these processes. So I wanted to talk about a series of questions here that I think are really interesting intervention points as we start to think about how new questions of finance, financialization, changes to risk profiles around finance and climate change stand to transform some of these processes. And the first thing I wanted to emphasize was, I think, the differentiation of this task. And that's both in terms of critical scholarship, of course, but also in terms of our praxis on this. And this is really trying to figure out where we're situating this kind of work within urban geography, especially. And that's a lot of what I was trying to kind of lay out as part of this intervention in City. And then, you know, thinking about kind of some of the broader questions that just start to develop from this kind of questioning. There is this question of, you know, how we see like finance, and something that I really like to emphasize in my work and I think is really important is, you know, certainly I think there is a temptation when we're looking at new financial experiments, new kind of ways of creating markets by finance, to look at the novelty, to look at emergence, to look at, you know, kind of new experiments, new ways states are being changed around large scale initiatives, dumps of capital into new spaces and infrastructural spheres. But I think it's equally important to keep an eye on this sense of defensiveness in finance, and especially thinking about, the fact that a lot of this is a response to both lingering crisis, ongoing crisis from, the 2008 financial collapse, of course, much broader crisis tendencies as well as these new risks of climate change, which are indeterminate and uncertain in all kinds of ways. So keeping this in the frame, I think, is really important. And then, so moving from there, I'll talk about this question of the state. And this is something I'm preoccupied with, again, a lot, especially on the kind of praxis end of this, because, certainly when we're thinking about regulation, we're following conversations within the financial industry itself, but we're also looking at, very quickly developing regulatory strategies that are taking, quite different forms, very active in places like the UK, very active in places like the US among kind of Green New Deal conversations with very different kinds of answers and solutions. And I think real openings to solving what is a fairly profound problem that even financial regulators are starting to acknowledge is a problem that is beyond a lot of their existing tools and capacities, I think. And something that I want to bring up, and this is really starting to build on this more specific engagement in the City paper, which of course you can read in the entirety since it's published, is this question of the normalcy of devaluation. So I'm thinking about things like stranded assets here and large-scale devaluation as part of climate change processes, but also trying to kind of think through and normalize some of these processes of devaluation, the state taking a role in actually affecting devaluation, and as a way of kind of provincializing some of the challenges that we face, and hopefully open up more of a sense of the ways that the state has already been involved in lots of ways, and this is not actually an exceptional moment of the state taking on new devaluation responsibilities. Okay, so starting out this question about the differentiation of this task. So I think something that to really pay attention to is this question of the uneven geographies of entitlement. And so this is part of the ongoing and very welcome and broadening of urban geography, when we're thinking from the global south, and of course thinking from a range of experiences of cities. I think that's something that can assume too much centrality for us when we're thinking about the intersection of finance and built environments is to assume formal property markets, to assume specific contours of the problem of value at risk that are very preoccupied with discussions in places like the United States, places like the UK. And then, so kind of moving on, this question of, if we're thinking more broadly, the limits to financial inclusion, then this question of the kind of diminishing returns to formality. So what do I mean here? I think a starting point for any of this work has to be to, again, provincialize our own research. So my research has by and large been in the context of the US. And so certainly I think that this has geared my work a lot more towards thinking about formal property markets, thinking about the way that large-scale state-led changes in things like depreciation allowances, structured devaluation that comes from regulatory decision-making can have these large-scale built environment effects. And I think that it's really important to acknowledge that that is a very real power. It is something that, this move to formalize property, to kind of bring more property into these regimes of legibility, you have things like property insurance. Certainly those are important kind of powers to keep in mind when we're thinking about the state-property relationship, but they're not universal powers, and they're certainly not even the, maybe the normal relationship that a lot of property will have both to climate change as a risk and to the role of the state. And so thinking about, the large scale geographies of informal settlements worldwide, this should be a kind of normal condition when we think about obduracy, ephemerality in relation to climate change, is that most places will not be affected in a way by the place, some of the processes that I'm getting at today. So I think there's a huge task here that we really should be articulating more and in lots of ways. And certainly some folks already have. I'm not exhaustively citing here, but I do a little bit more in the paper. So something I think is really interesting to push on more is this question of financial inclusion and the limits of financial inclusion. And in a lot of ways, when I'm seeing a lot of the programs that folks have been talking about yesterday, and in a lot of this literature on kind of new green finance, especially in the lens of resilience green bonds by entities like the World Bank, I do think it's important to look at it as part of this broader initiative towards financial inclusion. It's greenlining by another name. And certainly, I think we're seeing it in terms of municipal bond markets, the rise of subnational governmental entities as having financial visibility in new ways, as we see kind of new value capture strategies, infrastructural development mechanisms, and all these kind of formal financial instruments and markets being created, or hopefully being created at least in the eyes of the World Bank. But I don't think it's something that we should be thinking of as altogether distinct from these broader pushes for financial inclusion, which sometimes, of course, look very different. And this is things like microcredit. This is where this hits the ground in terms of rural livelihoods, in terms of the kind of everyday financial access and financial services of the poor. And so thinking this all the way down, I think starts to open up new questions for us about, the kind of ongoing disasters of microcredit. And this is something that has been developing for a long time. Plenty of folks have critiqued this in the scholarly literature, as well as in organizational practice around this. But we still see this, this return of financial inclusion in new forms around things like microcredit. So this is hitting the ground. There are a lot of kind of ways we can think about the social life of finance and the kind of governmentality of some of this stuff that isn't just elite kind of actors within cities. So, but I do think, on the one hand, we can ask about the limits to which this financial inclusion is willing to go. How far do we actually think about this going in terms of mortgage markets and property insurance? How thin is some of this when we're talking about what kind of infrastructure is actually being rolled out within cities of the global south by the World Bank? Are we only seeing kind of big infrastructural strategies like seawalls with a much broader set of a lack of inclusion, a lack of real willingness to financialize in some of the ways that property has been financialized facing climate risk? And I think a really important question on this is, we see these new ways of financializing this kind of risk and as a risk mitigation strategy being rolled out at the same time as we see, deepening strains and brittleness in the existing financialized networks of property and property insurance. So folks like Zach on this call, of course, folks like Rebecca Elliott as well. I think the work of these folks in looking at the strains of programs like the National Flood Insurance Program in the United States are really starting to, produce, I think, broader questions about the diminishing returns of entitlement, and saying, yes, it is, nominally there are state protections that were inherited from the Keynesian welfare state on this. What is the actual future of this? And so, in the real paradox of what might be developing in different geographies right now. And I think this is something, certainly it's the kind of thing that many folks who are working on this and folks in this room or this virtual room are talking about in their work, but certainly also something that we're seeing on the ground right now. And this is just a recent New York Times report on this. And this is looking at the progressive divestments of private mortgage holders to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. So turning more mortgages over to the state after hurricane events, and looking at kind of this recent trend to do this. And so I'll talk about the state as investor of last resort. This is an idea that Paul Langley and John Hogan Morris have been talking about a lot in relation to the history of quantitative easing, also responses to COVID and what we can learn from them in respect to climate response. I think this is one of these moves that they're talking about, nationalizing, kind of in a not particularly overt way, but in a quiet way, nationalizing more assets, turning more assets over to the remit of the state, which again, many folks have already predicted would happen, but I think is already happening. So the second thing I think is seeing, and I think it's a good segue because again, it's really pointing to the limited powers and the limitations of what finance can and will do around climate risk. But I think again, this need to kind of keep in mind both the speculative frontiers of all this, what again attracts so many researchers is the kind of new markets in creation. But again, I think we also do have to keep paying attention to, what is finance saying to finance around this, around the risks that they don't know how to mitigate. And so citing Zach here as well, this question of a fix for the spatial fix, I think is a great question to bring up more. And then this broader question of regulation. So in talking about defensive finance, this is something I've worked on in a lot of ways around things like the financial crisis and the questions of safe assets, how those are positioned within the Financial Stability Board, and a lot of these kind of broader regulatory changes after the financial crisis. But certainly one aspect that we can really see it is in this ongoing question of stranded assets, especially these kind of large scale enumerations of stranded asset risks around a carbon bubble. And there's a lot of ways to take this. Certainly, one way that it's been talked about a lot, including by me, has been in terms of this problem of unburnable carbon and the necessary devaluation of fossil fuel reserves and existing kind of proven reserves around this. Certainly, lots we could talk about here, but just to kind of set the scene. Basically saying, in terms of what we're thinking about in terms of states and in terms of institutional investors. That's both kind of direct exposure to, fossil fuel balance sheets and fossil fuel companies to an extent, but a lot of times it's much more this kind of broader geography of property and infrastructure that is rendered unusable. And that's, certainly institutional investors have more exposure to that broader geography, as do states or states to institutional investors themselves. And so I think one thing that we do have to think about in response to these kind of questions is certainly, I think, what the question that Zach has really raised about the future of the spatial fix, especially when we're thinking about, at-risk geographies like Florida real estate, that really are, have an outside presence in the financial system, remembering that when we're talking about, systemic risk to the financial system, we're seeing a very narrow depiction of the problem that really is looking at formal property regimes that really doesn't care about, the human suffering of climate change. It has a necessarily narrow view, which of course presents, many, many problems. So, in terms of the kind of arguments that Zach is advancing, which I won't talk about too much because, he's in this room and I don't want to expose myself too much. But I think that, there's a lot of really important stuff in what he's saying in relation to this. But I think that, we can continue to ask broader questions of the spatial fix as well. So one of these, which Zach is advancing, is saying, how are, certain kind of promises around the financialization of insurance buying enough time for investors to extract value before, the kind of inevitable devaluations, inevitable removals of specific places happen. And I think that this is an invitation for us to think more broadly in general about the spatial fix, because of course, these classic formations by folks like David Harvey, of course, as they coined these terms, is presuming that capital does have to stay in place for a long time to realize value. I think, besides the kind of insurance instruments that we can look at that can free capital from this, there's other things that we could look at. Certainly something that I've been preoccupied with for a long time is the creation of things like REITs that give capital more mobility. I think the work that Sage was doing yesterday really starts to open up more questions about how disaster capitalism frames much more narrow versions of spatial fixes that are much less dependent on the overall health and overall prosperity of an economy being invested in, that are much more demarcated legally, contractually, to protect themselves and to extract returns even in the absence of broader economic development out of infrastructural investment. And I think certainly we can see this in lots of ways with the disaster capitalist interventions, but I think there's other ways to find this too. I think it comes out a lot in how infrastructural development happens around things like renewable energy, where you see this large scale role of project finance, with very qualified ways of extracting value that really detach infrastructure from the broader conditions in which it is invested, are argued as a way of de-risking the investment. So again, these kind of ways that defensiveness really creeps in to a lot of these logics of novel investment. But then of course, the limits of this. And certainly, I think we do see lots of pushes today for increased regulation of this, including, of course, by institutional investors, and saying, there needs to be some form of state step in for this, increasingly seeing these arguments. And the question then becomes, what does that look like? Obviously, I think that when we're thinking about, these framings of devaluation risk to the whole financial system, we're building on this longer history of initiatives like Ceres, like the Carbon Disclosure Project, CBP, that were really instituting voluntary environmental risk disclosures, financial risk disclosures. The longer history of this, of course, goes back to things like the fossil fuel industry anyway. So Ceres was created in the aftermath of the Exxon Valdez disaster, but you see the growth of this, of course, around a lot of kind of voluntaristic social environmental responsibility, ESG stuff, a long history of greenwashing here that I don't need to tell people here about. But I think the more interesting relationship that's starting to emerge is the new kind of remit of the Financial Stability Board, a lot of the reorganizations up to a point of financial stability regulation that we saw after the financial crisis. So the creation of the SFB itself, this increasing turn to macroprudential regulation, so more attention to systemic risk, instead of this kind of microprudential focus on the health of any one institution. So certainly this is where we see this demand for new kinds of organization like the TCFD come from, as well as to stabilize this kind of plethora of independent voluntaristic schemes, which there's really dozens of these right now. At least there's a lot of national schemes, there's a lot of private sector schemes. So you're seeing again this kind of this move for more consistency, for more kind of organized reporting standards around financial disclosures. But as folks like Russ Christophers have said, this only goes so far, and in a lot of ways has reproduced the kind of broader problems of neoliberal, the kind of reassertion of neoliberal principles in the aftermath of the financial collapse, especially around this question of transparency as a mode of governing risk, and saying, this is absolutely this kind of market-led ideas of decision-making, presuming things like rational actors, and not really learning from the kind of broader lessons of the financial crisis. And so this is, there's a lot we could say about the TCFD. I think about it a lot because, of course, it's pretty important in the UK because figures like Mark Carney from the Bank of England were so important in setting this up. But of course, you'll find figures like Bloomberg in charge of it now. But it's, there's a lot we can talk about, but, this question of kind of separating out, physical risks versus liability and transition risks, and all the kind of enumeration of different kinds of risks that we might see disclosed. And this question of, when that stuff might become mandatory. Currently it's voluntary, it's recommended, but this is something that a lot of these institutional investors that, we're seeing interviewed are asking for, I think, in quiet ways or more overt ways. And then there becomes this question of, how far does that go? And this is where I think there is a real conversation opening up around the increased capacity and the increased legitimacy of large-scale state intervention, that's much more precautionary, that's much more active, that's not just about fixing market failures. And that's everything from kind of more mainstream versions of this, of course, to certainly I think the broader eco-socialist interventions we might see as part of more left Green New Deals or green recovery strategies. So I think when we're starting to think about this broader role from the state and kind of disrupting this kind of market disclosure focused way of thinking about defensive risk to the financial system, we're starting to think about precedents for state-led devaluation, for taking things like stranded assets and actually organizing that devaluation, different ways of nationalizing that risk, with many different kinds of equity questions, of course, and what taxpayers are taking on, and what is made of that opportunity once the state actually nationalizes a lot of different kinds of at-risk industries. It is, do we see the financial crisis all over again, where there's a quick move to reprivatize, a really limited opportunity to at least regulate these institutions in more fundamental ways, if not, much more fundamental reorganizations. So I think there's a lot of questions, not all of course I will get to here, but I think it's a good question to be kind of exploring as we go in this workshop and in the work that we're all doing. But one thing I wanted to highlight that I think is really interesting and important is to look, especially when we're thinking about these more formal property regimes, these geographies of entitled property, that we're thinking about in the US, the Anglo-American context, among others, is how to think about these ways that structural devaluation is really baked in to the existing geographies of property that we have right now. So saying, when we're thinking about structural devaluation around things like stranded assets, in lots of ways, that's nothing new. The state is already doing this in lots of ways that are quite subtle. If we're actually exposing that, do we actually expand the conversation around the potential instruments and policies that the state could implement, including for much more progressive purposes? And so, when we're getting to, the limits of this neoliberal macroprudential regulation that only goes so far, certainly you'll see folks like Brett Christopher's doing really good interventions here around, but you'll also see this in, kind of more mainstream policy notes emerging. That's certainly around things like, again, Knightian uncertainty. It's not probabilistic risk, it's more profound uncertainty. It's endogenous risks. It's not thinking about, the financial system as a kind of limited arm's length actor, but one that's, inextricably related to these risks that it's managing. And again, this question of, what might we see around this kind of enhanced role for central banks as well as the state writ large. And Paul and John's recent paper on this is really terrific, and I think directly draws some lines from COVID that I think will be really important in green recovery strategies, just because, again, the state has stepped in, as it did after the financial crisis, as an important investor. So, if we're thinking about precedents for state-led devaluation, for kind of taking on stranded assets and actually organizing the devaluation of large pools of value, I think the classic example in lots of ways when you're seeing the kind of creation of stranded assets as a term is actually electricity deregulation in the 1990s, that this was something that was already done in an organized way by regulators. But obviously, I think there's a lot of continuities with the financial crisis, the troubled asset relief program. So a lot of ways that state took assets on the books in order to devalue them. And I think we can see, again, things starting to emerge here around the kind of, again, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac holding more assets, and having more capacity to perhaps do this. But I think thinking larger, this is a really good paper by Nathan Sayer that if anyone hasn't read, it's been around a while, but I think he was really prescient in calling a lot of this out. He was thinking not necessarily about stranded assets per se, and I would say that there are some potential differences here that might be interesting to explore. But in terms of devaluation, more broadly, when we're thinking about the built environments, there is, this kind of, there is a question on both sides, with mitigation and adaptation that I think is really emerged into the mainstream in inextricable ways now, which I do think opens up new questions about what is the kind of direct government role in affecting devaluation, in managing devaluation in much more precautionary and proactive ways, because we are going to have to do this, and it is becoming increasingly clear that we are going to have to do this. So having an actual plan becomes really important. And so where I wanted to kind of make a more critical intervention here, so I'm just keeping an eye on my time, is to think about, this broader way that this gets framed. So one way that stranded assets gets framed as a problem to the state is thinking about, states like the UK that have been traditionally dependent to an extent on the tax receipts of oil and gas. And certainly you can see mainstream, more mainstream approaches like Caldecott thinking about, what is, what is the risk to the state? What is the kind of, existential threat, which I do think is real. It's a very variable power that states actually have to affect devaluation. I think this is something we should talk about more, because I don't think that geographies of ideas like modern monetary theory, I don't think actually has been thought about in a particularly geographically sensitive way. Thinking about the capacity of, the UK government or the US government to do this versus, governments with much less power and, without the kind of dollar Wall Street regime behind them, I think is another question. that we might do more. But even, thinking about the UK, I think there is a much more critical way of looking at a lot of these questions. So this is this same graph from the Financial Times that I had displayed a second ago. But if you actually look into the article that's behind this, you see this flattening of fossil fuel revenue. That's actually just because the UK government decided to reduce taxes on oil and gas. It was intended to boost profits at a time of trouble, but those tax rates did not go up after the oil industry was for a while then doing better. So there is always this kind of, there is always hidden giveaways to these industries that underpin some of the front stage discussions of the perils of fossil fuel devaluation. So I think, and this came up yesterday as well, we really do have to be following the example of folks like Renee Tapp and Kelly Kay and looking at the fiscal geographies of all these questions, in that, the kind of the tax questions of this are political questions. They are not inevitable outcomes of things like climate change. They are incredibly dense political constructions that have their own trajectories and often mean hidden devaluations, hidden giveaways to specific industries or investors. And so, this is, Sayer, of course, describes this. This is certainly something that we can get out of, a ton of geographical political economy, but again, to kind of reemphasize here that, of course, we're thinking about, this acute threat, and it becomes an acute threat around climate change that's framed in a specific language of crisis. I think it's really important to consider the normalized crisis of a lot of these devaluations. What are we actually quantifying? What are we not quantifying because it goes off the books? And so I think that, if we're thinking about climate change, we have to place it in terms of this broader business as usual devaluation, ruination, disinvestment that's highly normalized in places like the United States. And so this is, I'm quoting myself here, so you can read this in the paper, but just to highlight a few kind of big arguments here, I do think that something that's really important to keep a focus on that hasn't been focused on enough is how, when we're thinking about the lifetime of cities, how property developers, how appraisers, how the state has actually truncated the lifetime of built environments, both in the kind of ways that these built environments are represented on paper, but often with follow-on and knock-on effects into the actual foreshortening of lifetimes of those material geographies. So, the kind of decrease in the average building lifetime by, from say 40 years to 20 years to even shorter than that in some central business districts. The kind of normalization of the churn of built environments is something, that we both should pay attention to as an ontological condition, to say, built environments already were ephemeral in certain ways that we have to pay attention to when we're thinking about how to frame this existential risk of climate change, but also to look at the tools by which they affected these foreshortenings of lifetime, these structural devaluations. Some of them, of course, never anything that we would want to emulate. Some of them might actually have positive lessons. For example, if the state moved in as a much more progressive form of an investor of last resort as part of, say, a green investment authority, and one that was interested in nationalizing some of these property geographies. So, certainly this is examples that we might look at in terms of things like urban renewal. I think some of the more dramatic examples of this, large scale demolitions, property value write-downs, organized property value write-downs by urban governments, facilitated by the national state sometimes, in order to give value to property and brownfield property reinvestment. But it also has to do with things like accelerated depreciation and government tax shelters, a lot more normalized stuff that's written into the US tax code, again, focusing on the US here. And so how this, much more structural, much less dramatic than urban renewal, kind of normalization since the 1960s of things like accelerated depreciation, folks like Thomas Hanchett have looked at in some detail, have really structured and foreshortened what we can expect out of the property lifetime in US cities, including in things like the 1980s real estate bubble, but also, in more kind of normalized geographies of investment. And Thomas Hanchett talks a lot about the kind of geography of shopping malls and how that was structured and enabled by different forms of tax sheltering practices for real estate developers. Certainly, we can also look at it. This was the rise of Donald Trump. This is so it's not surprising to see his taxes look the way they do, of course, because he built what was a fortune, which was the ephemerality of that, I think is a real thing, but certainly making a killing off tax shelters in the 1980s. So this is something I won't belabor too much in this specific talk, but something that I've written about a bit in that paper, and I have some other work in review on that, so hopefully out soon. But I've looked at this in the history of real estate investment, but I'm also looking at it in the context of wind investment and the history of renewable energy investment. Because if you're looking at these kind of structural devaluations, structural manipulations of value, especially this kind of this prevalence of tax shelters, it's something that's really inescapable in the US context, that there have been deliberate government-abetted manipulations of value in order to make specific kinds of investment possible, and manipulations of devaluation in order to, provide basically giveaways to private financial investors in a way that is much more expensive than the state doing it itself, than the state as investor, the state as a kind of overt investor in these things. So a lot of hidden devaluation as instrument through things like infrastructural and property depreciation, and a lot of kind of ongoing manipulations of value. So this is the first wind boom in California in the 1980s, and this was actually a direct tax shelter to individuals, but it's something that we actually see developing in the modern tax equity industry in the United States, and that's predominantly large investment banks. So it's your JP Morgans, it's your Wells Fargos, it's and all the kind of big commercial banks. So there's a omnipresent geography of a lot of value being basically given away to large-scale investors, and a lot of kind of hidden depreciations, hidden devaluations that structure, things like wind production tax credits. So a lot of the kind of third-party financing that we're seeing for crucial pieces of infrastructure in the United States, with a real, problem in terms of rentierism because of the dependence on a very small amount of investors. And I'm happy to talk about that more. The way, the connection, that's the most important, I think, to devaluation is about the ability of these banks to actually write off their tax liability. So, pushing value off the books, pushing value into new forms, manipulating, contorting value into new forms via highly complicated and opaque instruments. So I've covered a lot of ground here, but hopefully this kind of creates some important or interesting, at least, discussion points for the workshop to follow and future work. I'm really trying to get my head around a lot of these questions of how some of these different trends are connected. But just again to say, I do think that this is a partial view of this. This is certainly kind of a situated view of this from a certain kind of corner of urban geography. I do think it's a really important one if we're thinking about how to relate geographies of property to broader questions of the financial system and financial system stability. I think even though, again, we're seeing these pushes towards financial inclusion by entities like the World Bank, when we're thinking about finance taking care of finance and prioritizing the assets that it thinks are valuable enough to present it with structural risks, I think we have to really question how big the investments in certain kinds of green bonds and in the kind of new experimental forms of financial inclusion will be, because I think it'll be a really telling evidence, if you like, of how much skin they actually have in the game, versus these kind of imperiled geographies of property in places like Florida. And then this question of, if we're starting to think about a broader role for the state as regulator, beyond this very limited arm's length, light touch role of the state as and governmental entities as a regulator and kind of standard setting body in private financial disclosure and risk disclosure, how do we think about this state power? And how do we think about what the state is doing already as we consider, what the kind of tools available to, a much more progressive state version of this might look like. So I think that's it. I think that's still only 10 minutes left for questions, but hopefully that's enough. But thanks, folks. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
All right, let me just tend to some stuff. Thank you so much, Sarah. That was fantastic. The chat box is open. Does anyone want to kick us off with a question? Feel free to type in there. I have so many. Let's kick us off with one. So you talk about this differentiated task for scholarship and for praxis. And I would like to hear from you about how you think about that personally, right? You're someone who is involved in lots of discussion. So how do you engage? You know, how do you work from specific corners as a critical geographer into this conversation? And what does that look like? You know, what is that progressive state? How are you translating these kind of insights into that thinking?
Yeah, and I think this would be a really interesting question to hear from other folks in the room, especially folks who work in the global south on too, because I think something that we've really seen, and I do think it's a problem in this corner of scholarship, is it is so Anglo-American. And I write about California a lot because that's what I know. And so I want to keep writing about what I know, of course, but I think there is a question of, you know, in forums like this, actually creating more structural space so that a few examples don't dominate everything. What I would say, I think, is the importance of continuing to look at places like California, like the US context, is exactly the kind of intervention Sage was making in yesterday's talk, which I think she's right on, that things like relational comparison from Jill Hart are crucial here. And something that I was kind of talking with Antoine about after his paper is, I think, this question of, you know, the geographies of innovation really do matter, in that, you know, financial instruments come from someplace, and they're created. And I think, you know this as well as I do, Zach, in California, that, you know, they're created under extraordinary pressure sometimes. You know, Proposition 13, as this constraining influence on governmental spending power, actually did have this incredibly important role in, you know, because California was a place that continued to have capital invested in it, in creating new financial instruments, because, you know, and this is Alberta Sprague's really important intervention, although I don't think she makes it as critically as we would, is to say, you know, there are problems created that finance comes in to help solve. And I think that some of those places become really interesting because it's not a surprise that they're the ones exporting financial instruments to other places that are working under constraints. That's exactly what they were organized to do. So I think we can learn from these relational forms of comparison, but also about, it's not that it's not financial, you know, innovation under conditions of a state's own choosing. A lot of times it is under pressure. And so I think that focus on brittleness is one to kind of keep in frame here. You know, again, because it's provincializing the global north, and it's saying, yeah, you have a huge muni bond market in the US. It's in dire straits in some ways. And so even as these exports are happening, you know, I think it does create a really different contour to the problem than, hey, we're exporting what worked in the US, because it doesn't. So that's a partial answer, but I think there's a lot of other ones.
No, absolutely. I think it's something that really holds true, thinking, again, as someone who has experience with California as a sort of adopted Californian for a period, but comes from Florida and researches Florida, which is also often cited as a sort of a kind of key case. And yet, you know, we see in Florida how a place of so-called, you know, financial innovation, that the sort of organizing test case itself is always in a state of crisis. And creativity. And it's really important, I think, to think from that at the same time as recognizing those limits. But yeah, what about while we wait for another question to come in, maybe the second part of that question, right? So how do we take that understanding and not just hold the scholarly space, but how do we try to engage with the emergence before us, right? Because I think that's something that almost everyone that I see on this call is interested in ultimately, right? Like, how do we engage with the emergence of this new space of discourse where it feels like some things are open, right? Some things are up for grabs. We're still coming to understand what exactly the problem is, let alone defining the solution. So how do you do that?
Well, I mean, and this is for certainly, like, my policy making work or my, you know, my policy engaged work is absolutely in this realm, right? Because I think we have these great ideas, you know, like in that, you know, kind of a green investment authority, Very cool. I mean, I think that, you know, my dream vision of a lot of this is I think like a lot of folks is a kind of utility sector model of finance, right? You know, we know that, you know, mitigating and adapting to climate change is expensive, especially the adaptation side, you know, where, you know, yeah, you know, green energy isn't so much of a problem anymore because people can make money. Maybe it's not as much money as they'd like to make, but, you know, it's not as difficult as adaptation. But, you know, so yeah, so say we do have, you know, say we have Groy, what's our utopian model of what we get for these green, and sorry, this is a reference to yesterday for folks, but from Hannah Hilbrandt and oh shoot, yeah, sorry, you know, I know your name, I'm just blanking because I'm panicking. But sorry, but the, you know, so we say we have these ideal versions of this, and they're going to face some of the same problems, right? And so I think that there actually is a kind of speculative act that we have to make and say, yeah, so say we get say we do get nationalizations of all these troubled industries, and yeah, we have all these national oil companies and they have to write down the value of all these oil assets. I think we have to imagine what the problems that they're going to face are, because they're not going to be, some of the problems are going to be the same problems in terms of devaluation. You know, and I think that this question of how much financial freedom and fiscal freedom different kinds of states have is an incredibly important situated political question that looks very different in the US versus, you know, Mozambique trying to do this. You know, the kind of the ways that you can have limited reform to the kind of state and the kind of powers of state action in the UK or the US that does not translate into the same powers for all places. And I think this is where, you know, kind of national, you know, discussions of a transformed national set of programs actually do really break with degrowth in important ways, because this question of, yes, in the you know, in a kind of near-term vision, we can assume a greater state role that has these increased powers, versus folks who are saying, this is not probable. You would have to have such a profound reorganization in all the Bretton Woods institutions, et cetera, you know, including, you know, probably new Chinese investment, in order for us to have the power to do that. And I think that's where we have to have pretty frank conversations about what's not being said by, again, MMT and all this. Because yeah, I mean, even Puerto Rico is not going to have this freedom unless Puerto Rico's political situation changes in the ways we hope it will.
That's a great point. And again, just keeping my eye on the chat for other questions, please bring them in.
And Tontuan, totally, I think you're, yeah, the Dan and Emily, they're the best. This is their work is brilliant. And I'm excited to see more French stuff that I haven't read. Okay,
here we go. We've got a couple. Let's see if I can adjust the box. Actually, yeah. So Jake asks, has been much work done on stranded assets and how it impacts the traditionally conservatizing effects of property ownership? For example, yeah, where managed retreats are happening, how does it impact local political feeling?
We need Liz Koslov and Rebecca Elliott on this call, especially Liz, I think, because yeah, where is the kind of Engels housing question as it meets like Liz's work on managed retreat? And when I think, you know, I was just looking at Rebecca's work, A Scarier Than Another Storm piece, and I think it really gets at some of these more kind of, you know, affective, sociocultural dimensions of this, which I have to imagine are very real. The kind of conventional stranded assets discourse, A, is not that well developed, and B is, you know, it is folks like, you know, Caldecott and there's a very conservative stranded assets conversation that's led by entities like Carbon Tracker, doing some good work up to a point, but, you know, they're really interested in financial system stability, not the kind of everyday asset stranding where this hits the ground. And I think you have to look at work like Zach's or Rebecca's or Liz's to really start to get that. But I mean, there's a reason we want more people to do work in this, because I think that's a great research question. And I would say there's that great issue that Gordon MacLeod, Chris Herring, and I think actually Emily Rosenman were involved with the return of Engels housing question around Hurricane Katrina. And I think that's probably some of the coolest work that's already starting to engage this stuff, and explicitly again on the kind of conservative property ownership. I would imagine too, in a really different vein, some of the work that folks like Daniel Aldana Cohen has done with Data for Progress on like a Green New Deal for public housing, I think are going to get at the alternatives to this in interesting ways. Especially, when does public housing become the kind of version of this that works for most people, because that's the way the state protects people. I think that's a great question that hasn't been asked enough too.
I would also add to that Linda Shai's work on adaptation and the kind of economic vulnerability of places, and how the mechanisms of local governance trap local officials when they're trying to make long-term or regional planning decisions to mitigate risk, and how that fiscal capacity question sort of shapes decision-making. I think it's a really good meso level between Liz and Rebecca's work and maybe some of these broader questions. All right, maybe
Linda Stein, Zach, can you put the reference in the chat? Because I would love to go get that right now.
Yeah, I will look at that, and then maybe we can answer
looks like the dual,
and then we'll transition out to the workshop.
Awesome. Yeah, so the question, the states do a role of devaluing assets and providing liquidity, Greenspan put affect continued accumulation on one hand and built environment on the other. Yeah, I mean, because I think that the, yeah, this is a good question. And one I'm not sure I have the complete answer to. I'm trying to think about like because the nearest term work on this is probably Paul Langley's, and both, I think you'd have to triangulate that recent work. That paper with John Hogan Morris is great. It's pretty short, but I think the broader liquidity loss book that he did about quantitative easing after the financial crisis would be interesting in some of this, because I think there is this, there's this question of the kind of the radical novelty of quantitative easing that, this was not a normal role for the state, right? This is not in accordance with Greenspan at all. This was incredibly radical. It was legitimated by the state, but it was, I think there's a lot to be said about how different a strategy this was, but then the kind of the normalization of this strategy again for COVID, and that this has become already a kind of sly way of increasing the government role. The providing liquidity, it's tricky because it's like, it's the government has done everything it can within conventional limits to provide liquidity at this point, right? It's like, how much lower can interest rates be? And this is where we get at the kind of limits to conventional, monetary policy management in the neoliberal style, because, if you're only willing to stick with those tools, we've hit them. That's what the UK and the US have done, and among others, and that's what's creating this crisis in yields that's driving so many of these unconventional forms of investment. And I didn't talk about that much, but we could have talked about it much more. I mean, why are they doing green investments? It's not just because they're fleeing stranded assets and freeing brown assets into green assets. It's because they need slightly riskier things to invest in, because institutional investors have had collapsed yields because of the total lack of value of conventional, U.S. sovereign debt. So I think there's a lot more to be said. And I think there's probably a really interesting, more to what you're asking, I think this kind of structural question of how do different forms of kind of conventional monetary policy, I would say this is more, it's really not monetary policy after this point, it's fiscal policy, it's broader than monetary regulation, really. But how the different forms of kind of state action might work against each other, I think is a really good question that, I think is a great thing to think through more.